Hi, American literature friends. This is a video about Upton Sinclair and Chapter 9 from The Jungle. Chapter 9, the complete Chapter 9 is in the book, and there's a link to it online that you can see right here. I'm going to spend just a few minutes going through Sinclair and his career, where he fits into American literature, and then we will dive into Chapter 9, which is the most famous chapter from The Jungle, the chapter that you always see anthologized because of the way that it's easy to break it into three pieces. There is the beginning half, which is about government corruption, and then and then he shifts into sort of corporate corruption, but you can even break the corporate corruption down and stuff into two pieces. The first is the way that the meat products are dangerous and poisoned, and then the second one is how the meat packing factories and the meat packing industry is dangerous to the workers. Sinclair, as you see this picture of him right here. He was born in Baltimore in 1878. He died in 1968 in New Jersey. If you have a book handy, on page 1148 and 1149, they talk about how he grew up in Baltimore, and then his family moved to New York City. Sinclair went to the City College of New York, and it was while he was a college student at the City College of New York that he started writing for newspapers and magazines. And that is really most of Sinclair's career, the way that he made his living, not what he's famous for and not what he's in American literature for, but the way that he made his living and most of his work, he probably would have thought of himself as a journalist. He belonged to a very particular kind of journalism of that early 20th century. He started writing right at the beginning of the 20th century. He would have been in college or just graduated from college right as the 1800s turned into the 1900s and the 20th century started. As they tell you in the book on 1149, by 1904, Sinclair was devoting himself to muckraking, a term for publishing exposés of corruption in business or government, usually written by writers from the progressive movement in America who wanted to reveal the wretchedness of urban poverty that they attributed to dishonest business practices. So Sinclair is one of the most famous group of people who are now classified as muckrakers. And that phrase was coined by President Teddy Roosevelt for specifically journalists and writers who were trying to uncover problems and corruption and things like that, trying to stir up controversy and reveal problems and corruption in both government and corporate big business and industry. That is because historically the muckraking movement goes alongside the rise of labor unions in the government, and you see a little bit of that labor union corruption in this book, but also the rise of these this first wave of immensely wealthy industrialists in American history, like William Randolph Hearst, who owned most of the media in the United States at that time, and Andrew Carnegie, and the Rockefellers. So this first group of people who controlled industries and often monopolized industries, and those industries many of those industries were eventually broken up by President Roosevelt's trust-busting initiatives because of the work of people like Upton Sinclair to expose their corruption. And you see that in here. The Jungle, Upton Sinclair really has two most famous books, and the most famous by far is The Jungle. Chapter 9 from The Jungle is what we're going to read. The other famous one, and The Jungle is about the meatpacking industry, specifically in Chicago, but really in the upper Midwest, Chicago, Wisconsin, that area, the sort of not farms where the cattle were grown, but the meat packing and processing plants where the cattle were shipped to and processed and canned and turned into the meat that would go to grocery stores. His other famous book is Oil. It's called Oil. It is about the rise of the oil industry in America, and especially in the American West, like in California. It was turned into a movie a few years ago called There Will Be Blood, if you've seen that movie. But those are the two things that he's really known for. He wrote other books, but those are the ones that he's really known for, The Jungle and Oil. You see right here they talk about how he was writing during the Progressive era. he describes the world of progressive and the world of industrialized America from both the working man's and the industrialist point of view. So the people who work in the factories and also the people who own and run the factories. What else do they tell us? Sinclair's novel, to get specific about the jungle, on 1149 in the book, they talk about Sinclair's novel described horrific practices in the meatpacking industry. And it caused a public uproar that partly contributed to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Those two laws would eventually become the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration that we have today. So the longest lasting impact of this book is that it was really popular when it first came out because people were so disgusted by the ways it talked about the meatpacking industry. So disgusted, in fact, that it led to the first food safety laws in this country and what would eventually become the Food and Drug Administration and the Food and Drug Act. Let's see if there's anything. The other thing that is important about this book is the immense popularity of The Jungle, as they tell you on 1150, owes as much to its sentimental and romantic style as to its timely attack on capitalism. It has a believable and sympathetic hero in Georgios Rudkus, a Lithuanian immigrant whose desire to improve his condition and willingness to work in the most difficult conditions makes him instantly recognizable as an American type. Yet instead of following Georgios' rise in fortune, the novel unfolds as a story of personal tragedy. And the novel's story of the destruction of Georgios and essentially his entire family by the forces of corporate greed and poverty is a tale of horror almost beyond tragedy. Georgios loses everything, including most of his family members, and wanders freezing, sick, and starving in the wintry streets of Chicago. So if you read the entire book, The Jungle, what it is really the story of is the story of this immigrant who comes to the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, hoping for a better life, hoping to pull himself and his family up by the bootstraps, and what he gets instead is sort of manipulated and chewed up and ground up by the industrial processes of the United States, and also the government corruption from the government that's supposed to protect workers and protect their rights. By the end of the story, Georgios' father is dead, his wife is dead, his daughter is a prostitute. It's really, instead of the story of the American dream, it is the story of this American nightmare. Because you have this immigrant who comes and he misses the American dream. Or arguably, I think Sinclair would say, the American dream failed him in particular. They talk on 1150 about Upton Sinclair's later life. He continued he continued as a journalist and writer for the rest of his life. He also got into politics in California in the 1920s and 1930s. And he was a celebrity when he died because of the way he was perceived to have helped influence politics in a good way, especially the way that the progressive era led into the New Deal from President Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and 1940s. So what I want to dive into here is The Jungle, and like I said, I really want to think about it in these three parts. The first part is Georgios getting into the Union and that sort of government corruption that the first couple of pages covers, and then the novel shifts and changes to the food dangers, the nastiness of the food, the grossness of the food, the real danger, all the pollution of the food in a bunch of different ways. And then the last page or two covers how dangerous it is to work in one of these meat packing plants. Let's see if we can find this picture. Here we go. Here is the original cover of The Jungle, as you can see right here. When it first came out in 1904. There's a famous picture. Let's see if we can find it down here. Some of these, if you just have a look on Wikipedia or Google, you can see if you just Google the Jungle, you'll see these pictures of stockyards. Here's one of the famous pictures of the stockyard. These are all cattle waiting to be brought into the stockyard. You can see these guys walking on the pins that divide all the cattle, and they're going to be taken into this factory and processed. And then the other really famous picture, and then Sinclair talks about the meat inspectors at one point in chapter 9. This is a picture of the meat inspectors inspecting meat. Let's see if we can find the other picture, the other famous picture. I don't see it right now. So what you get is Sinclair uses this character, this Lithuanian immigrant, Georgius, as a way to really talk about what you get in chapter 9 is people come and tell him things that they've seen working in the meatpacking plant. And so the first part where he becomes a citizen and gets to vote is his personal experience. And then what you get is other people who he becomes friends with and who work in the meatpacking plant come and tell him all these horror stories about awful things they have seen. You see, if you've got a book handy, this is at the bottom of 1150. One of the first consequences of the discovery of the Union was that Georgius became desirous of learning English. And so he's an immigrant, just arrived here, he wants to learn English. He wanted to know what was going on at the meetings and be able to take part in them. He's wanting to join this labor union because it helps protect the workers, helps give them rights. Then Georgius became sorry he could not read himself, and later on in the winter, when someone told him that there was a night school that was free, he went and enrolled. Also, the Union made another great difference with him. It made him begin to pay attention to the country. It was the beginning of democracy with him. It was a little state, the Union, a miniature republic. And this is where Georgius, the Union argues for people having the morning off so they can go vote. The Union helps the workers become citizens. However, and that all sounds like a good thing. You're an immigrant, you have this organization at the company that you work for that helps you become a citizen, helps you learn to read, helps you vote. But even that is corrupted, and that is really the introduction to the corruption in this entire system for Georgius. When Georgius had been working about 3 weeks at Brown's, there had come to him one noontime a man who was employed by a night watchman, and who asked him if he would not like to take out naturalization papers. And so one of the Union guys helps him become a citizen, but that's really part of the corruption, because the reason that they want him to become a citizen, as you find out in the next couple of paragraphs, is that they want him to vote for the Democratic candidate, who is this guy named Mike Scully, who is totally corrupt and who controls it and who wins every election because they stuff the ballot box. You have this paragraph. A month or two later, Georgius had another interview with the same man who told him where to go to register. And finally, when election day came, the packing houses posted a notice that men who desired to vote might remain away until 9 in the morning. Georgius and the rest of his flock went into the back room of a saloon, showed each of them where and how to mark a ballot, and then gave each $2 and took them to the polling place, where there was a policeman on duty, especially to see if they got through all right. Georgius felt quite proud of his good luck until he got home and met Jonas, who had taken the leader aside and whispered to him, offering to vote 3 times for $4, which offer had been accepted. And so what you're getting right there is the Union people are paying everybody in the Union to vote for the candidate that they want to win, and they're also stuffing the ballot box. You've got people voting multiple times, like Georgius's friend does. And now in the Union, Georgius met men who explained all this mystery to him, and he learned that America differed from Russia and that its government existed under the form of a democracy. The officials who ruled it got all the graft, had to be elected first. So instead of Russia with the kings and queens and the monarchy and all of that kind of stuff, America has a democracy. But part of Sinclair's point here is that the democracy, you have this appearance of freedom and people choosing their leaders and those kinds of things. But part of Sinclair's point is that's all a fraud. The elections are rigged, the corporations and the unions control everything, and people aren't really as free as the American dream would have you believe. You get this long paragraph right here, and now in the Union, this paragraph that begins, and now in the Union, Georgius met men. This is where you get the description of Mike Scully, who is the leader of the union for the packing workers, the meat packers, and essentially Mike Scully runs everything in the city. He has more power than the mayor. He tells the mayor what to do. And the next couple of paragraphs give this description of all the ways that Scully is corrupt. He doesn't pay any taxes. He uses city resources. He gets free water from the city. He even controls this secret fraternal order. Scully had all the jobs in the fire department at his disposal, and all of the rest of the city graft to the stockyards. Even the Packers were in awe of him, and he means the meat packers. If you know the football team, the professional football team, the Packers, that's how they got their name. They were originally founded as a football team of guys who were meat packers. Even the Packers were in awe of him, so the men said. It gave them pleasure to believe this, for Scully stood as the people's man. And the specific example that Sinclair gives of this corruption is his description of Bubbly Creek, which is this little creek that runs into the Chicago River. I'm going to pull up a picture of it here. You can see this picture of it here. This is a recent picture of it, and you can see it looks relatively clean. There's even a water processing plant in the background. And then here is a picture from the time period that Sinclair is talking about. This is the same picture, same creek, and you can see what this creek is. It runs in the district where all the meat packing factories are, and so what they do is they just dump all of their waste, totally unfiltered, just raw waste, all getting dumped into this creek, so that you can see what this guy is standing on here is basically an island of like lard and animal waste and that kind of stuff. And Sinclair talks about that on 1153 if you've got a book. And in this paragraph that begins, even the Packers were in awe of him, where he talks about how Bubbly Creek is an arm of the Chicago River, forms the southern boundary of the yards, and that's the yards where they keep all the livestock like the cows and pigs and things like that, and where they dump the factories all dump their waste into that creek. One long arm of it is blind, so he means it's like it's a dead end. And the filth stays there forever and a day. The grease and chemicals that are poured into it undergo all sorts of strange transformations. Here and there, the grease and filth have caked solid, and the creek looks like a bed of lava. Well, there you go right there. That's what he's describing right there, is grease and lard just caking solid. The Packers used to leave the creek that way till every now and then the surface would catch on fire and burn furiously, and the fire department will have to come and put it out. So much grease and animal fat piles up on top of this little creek that every once in a while it'll just catch on fire till it burns off all of the grease from the water, and the fire department has to put the fire out. And it is in the next paragraph, the paragraph that begins, and there were things even stranger than this, right here. This is where chapter 9 really shifts from the union corruption and Mike Scully, the union boss, and how corrupt the union is. It shifts into the corruption of the corporations, specifically the meat companies, because it first digs into all the ways that they send out bad meat. Especially in Illinois, in the areas around Chicago, but really nationwide too. There were things even stranger than this. The Packers had secret mains through which they stole billions of gallons of the city's water. The newspapers had been full of this scandal, but nobody had been punished. And then there was the condemned meat industry with its endless horrors. The people of Chicago saw the government inspectors in Packing Town, and they all took that to mean that they were protected from diseased meat. They did not understand that these 163 inspectors had been appointed at the request of the Packers, and that they were paid by the United States government to certify that all the diseased meat was kept in state. So all that the inspectors do, all that the federal government inspectors do, is make sure that no bad meat goes out of Chicago to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. What that means is all the bad meat, all the local meat that everybody's buying from these places, is all the bad meat that couldn't be shipped out of state. So that's the first problem right there. They had no authority beyond that for the inspection of meat to be sold in the city or state. And shortly afterward, one of these made the discovery that the carcasses of steers, which had been condemned as tubercular by the government inspectors, so they are selling cattle and pigs that have tuberculosis, that have all kinds of cholera. If you don't know what cholera is a disease that killed many people in the first 10 or 20 years of the 20th century. And so they will get all these sick animals, slaughter them, and sell them locally. They just can't ship them out of state into other countries. Georges heard all of these things little by little. You see this right here. Georges heard all these things little by little, the gossip of those who were obliged to perpetrate them. And so he hears all this from people who work in the plants who have to do all these awful things. It seemed as if every time you met a person from a new department, you heard of new swindles and new crimes. And the real disgusting thing that Sinclair talks about on 1154 and 1155 in the book, and in this section of chapter 9, is canned meat and potted meat. If you know what that is, we still have canned meat and potted meat. It is much more regulated now. But canned meat and potted meat is still what it always was. It is the sort of leftovers from meat processing. The difference is that what is described in this book is just every awful leftover. Diseased cattle that they bleach so that it doesn't stink and things like that. These are cattle that have been fed on whiskey malt, the refuse of the breweries. And so what they do is take all the garbage that's left over from the beer breweries and feed that to the cattle to make them fat, even though it gives them diseases and boils and blisters on their skin. And you get the sentence at the end of that paragraph. It was stuff such as this that made the embalmed beef that had killed several times as many United States soldiers as all the bullets of the Spaniards. Only the army beef, besides, was not fresh canned. It was old stuff that had been lying for years in the cellars. What he is talking about is the Spanish-American War from the 1898 and the simple statistical fact that many U.S. soldiers died from food poisoning from getting this bad canned meat from these packing places in places like Chicago, Milwaukee, places like that. Then one Sunday evening, Georges sat puffing his pipe by the kitchen stove, talking with an old fellow whom Jonas had introduced, who worked at the canning rooms at Durham's. And Georges learned a few things about the great and only Durham canned goods. This is where he shifts from potted meat to canned meat. Where he shifts from canned meat to potted meat. And he talks about potted chicken, there was potted game, potted grouse, potted ham, deviled ham, deviled as the men called it. Deviled ham was made out of the waste ends of smoked beef that were too small to be sliced by the machines. Tripe, if you don't know what tripe is, that's animal intestines. Dyed with chemicals so that it wouldn't show white. Trimmings of ham and corned beef, so just all the leftovers when they make sliced meat. And finally, the hard cartilaginous gullets of beef after the tongues have been cut out. So basically animal cartilage that they just pound up and process. All this ingenious mixture was ground up and flavored with spices to make it taste like something. And so you would buy these cans of potted meat cheaply, much cheaper than buying, steak or a ham or something like that. But it was just all the leftover trash and garbage. He goes on in that paragraph to talk about how they would take old horses and kill them and mix them in with the beef, and also that they would get goats and slaughter them and mix them in and sell them as lamb. So if you were buying lamb, which would have been more expensive meat than ham or beef or something like that, because it was seen, and even now it's seen as like a specialty meat. What you were really buying is maybe 60% lamb and 40% goat meat. If you've got the book, that's on page 1155. And if you're here, that is at the end of this paragraph that begins, then one Sunday evening, you get the goats and the lamb stuff at the end of that. A good part of what it buys for lamb and mutton is really goat's flesh. And that is where then you get the next paragraph. There was another interesting set of statistics that a person might have gathered in Packingtown. Those are the various afflictions of the workers. And this is where Sinclair shifts again. So now he's gone through the union corruption. Now he's gone through the corruption, the sort of disease and pollution of the animals and the food that you would get from these places. The last thing that he covers in this chapter is how dangerous it is to be a worker in these places. And this is what really mattered most to him, and what he really wanted people to take from this book. What people really took from this book was the part we just covered. They weren't that worried about people working in the factory. They were much more disgusted and worried about the bad food that was being shipped out. But the conditions of the workers are what was really most important to Sinclair as part of his sort of progressive political. He wanted to improve things for the average workers in the United States. You see that he digs into that. Those are the various afflictions of the workers. When Georges had first inspected the packing plants with Zedivlis, he had marveled while he listened to tale of all the things that were made out of the carcasses of animals. The workers in each of them had their own peculiar diseases. And so what he's saying is different workers who do different things in the factories have different problems, different issues. And what he really does in this big last paragraph that starts off, there were the men in the pickle rooms, for instance, where old Antinous had gotten his death. That is Gergis's father, who died working in the factory. What he does is give you this long list of all these awful things that happen to people who work in these plants. For instance, where old Antinous had gotten his death, scarce a one of these had not some spot of horror on his person. If you don't know what pickling is, it is that like vinegar pickling of food in vinegar and stuff like that. So what would happen is these guys would get a little cut or something. It would get infected, turn into a boil or a sore. Let a man so much as scrape his finger pushing a truck in the pickle rooms, he might have a sore that would put him out of this world. All the joints in his fingers might be eaten by the acid one by one. Of the butchers and the floorsmen, so these are the guys who cut up the meat, the butchers and the floorsmen, the beef boners and trimmers, and of those who use knives, you could scarcely find a person who had the use of his thumbs. Time and time again, the base of it had been slashed till it was a mere hump of flesh. So these guys, their hands get cut up and destroyed. They would have no nails. They'd have them worn off pulling hides. Their knuckles were so swollen that their fingers spread out like a fan. So they get arthritic, just crumbly fingers. There were men who worked in the cooking rooms in the midst of steam and sickening odors by artificial light. In these rooms, the germs of tuberculosis might live for 2 years. There were the beef luggers who carried 200-pound quarters into the refrigerator cars, a fearful kind of work that began at 4 o'clock in the morning and that wore out the most powerful men in a few years. And so it's just like destroy these guys physically, their backs, their legs. There were those who worked in the chilling rooms, those whose special disease was rheumatism. If you don't know what that is, that's like extreme arthritis. There were the wool pluckers, whose hands went to pieces even sooner than the hands of the pickle men, for the pelts of sheep had to be painted with acid to loosen the wool. So they would get the sheep, and before they killed them, to turn them into meat, they would have to pluck them, and they would put this acid on them. And if you were one of the guys who pulled the fur, the wool off of the sheep, the acid would just basically burn your fingers off your hands. And he goes through this long list of all these awful things that happen. And worst of all, however, were the fertilizer men, those who served in the cooking room. These people would not be shown to any visitor, for the odor of the fertilizer men would scare any ordinary visitor at 100 yards. So these are the guys who take all of the poop from the animals in the yards and turn it into fertilizer, and they stink, and they can never get rid of the stink. And then the one that people always remember, and maybe the worst of this whole list right here at the end in the last few sentences. And as for the other men who worked in tank rooms full of steam, and in some of which there were open vats near the level of the floor, their peculiar trouble was that they fell into the vats. So they would have these vats of boiling water to dump these animals in and to boil off their hair and anything like that was left. And occasionally people would fall into those boiling vats of meat. And when they were fished out, there was never enough of them left to be worth exhibiting. Sometimes they would be overlooked for days, till all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Durham's pure leaf lard. So what he is saying is, sometimes even these workers would fall into the vats, and they would just become a part of the meat too, because they couldn't be saved out of those big boiling vats. So like they would get their bones out a few hours or a few days later, but those people just became a part of like the canned or processed meat that you would buy. Like they might become a hot dog or a can of corned beef or something like that. So he gives you this long description of all the horrors of this particular, of being a worker in this experience. The union that is supposed to take care of people, but is really just set up, to be corrupt and make money for the union leaders. And then all of the awful poisoned food that the companies send out, the potted meat, the canned meat, all these leftovers, and everything they can come up with to package them and process them and sell them to people. And then the last part of it is this discussion of all of the dangers of working in a place like this, from your fingers getting eaten off by acid or cut off by knives, to falling into a boiling meat vat and becoming part of the product. Sinclair's real goal in writing this book was, like I said, his real concern was to improve conditions for the workers, to make things better for the workers. The effect that he got, the book had some effect, but the effect it really had was the FDA, all the food safety laws and things like that got passed. So it didn't quite have the effect that he intended. He has that famous line, and I think it's mentioned in the prompt, where he says, "I aimed at the public's heart, and instead I hit it in the stomach." So he felt like the book sort of missed the mark. Let me look really quickly at the prompt. I'm gonna try not to forget to do that. The response topic. In his most famous quote about the jungle, Upton Sinclair said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." How does Chapter 9 present horrors that are not sentimental or romanticized, but are physical and visceral? Think about the ways that he's not trying to make this like some pumped up horror movie. He's just trying to tell you basic but awful and dangerous things that happen in these plants. How is this not sentimental or romanticized, but physical and visceral? He's just trying to report this series of horrible things to you. That is, what are the specific horrors presented in this chapter? And how does Sinclair use Georges as a vehicle for showing these horrors? It's almost part of what it's asking is, how is Georges almost like this tour guide who takes you on a tour of all these horrors related to the meat packing plants in Chicago? So if you've got questions about Upton Sinclair, about the jungle, about the prompt, about muckraking, about any of that stuff, be in touch with me, and we can dig into them more, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. But otherwise, I hope this is often one of the things that people remember about this class, Chapter 9 of the jungle. I think in part because it is so horrifying, and it is all based. Sinclair himself worked in a meatpacking plant for a few months so that he would have the knowledge to write this book. So it's all based in fact. And in fact, when people came back to check him, they were like, it's even worse than what he said it was. He didn't make it as bad. He didn't show it as bad as it really is. So like I said, this is often one of the texts that people remember from this class. So if you want to dig more into it, I'll be happy to answer questions that you have. But I hope this was a good enough guide and introduction to Chapter 9 of the jungle. Thanks a lot, guys.